Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire, and I'm so glad you've joined me today. I thought it would be fun to focus on a product that many crafters already have. I know times are tough right now, so I wanted to give you some ideas for a product that is a staple for crafters, and that is Vellum. Now, I will be showing you many different techniques today using Vellum. I'll be using lots of great new products from Gina K Designs, but these can be done with products you already have. I'm excited because this is definitely Gina K's best release ever, and I'll be using lots of those products today. Let's start with this example. It's a card made of vellum, so it's see-through around the edges. But I do a fun spotlight technique where the coloring is on the inside. This card features the beautiful new Gina K Designs Timeless Poppies stamp set. This is a 6x8 stamp set, so that main floral image is very large, and there's lots of sentiments included. I have a piece of heavyweight vellum that is 8.5 inches by 11. I'm cutting it down the center at 4 1/4. Then I will fold that in half at 5.5 inches. So score at 5.5 inches and then fold it in half. This creates a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding note card. This is a size I normally do, but this time it's made of vellum. And you can see how it's see-through, but it's sturdy because I chose a heavyweight vellum, and I'll link below to the one I use. I have my MISTI stamping tool here. You can use any stamping tool or acrylic block you want. And I also have a sticky mat that I like to use with my stamping tool. I'll link to the sticky mat that I use below. I cut it down to fit into my MISTI. I have a little mini note card here that is 2 3/4 inches wide and 4 inches tall. I put that on the sticky mat, and then I put our vellum note card on top of that. This sticky mat holds them in place. Those aren't glued together, they're just held by the sticky mat. Now I have our large floral image from the stamp set that I showed you. I'll put that into my stamping tool, then use my anti-static powder tool over the vellum. I want to make sure that I use that pretty generously so we don't have messy embossing. Now I've inked up my stamp with VersaMark Ink, and I'm using a dry erase eraser to press across the surface. You could use your hand if you wanted to. Now I can be sure that all the ink transferred on to our vellum note card. Next, I'm adding gold embossing powder. You can see how it's covering all the VersaMark ink, and then I will heat set that. If you keep your heat gun moving and make sure it's warm before you use it, you can heat set the gold embossing powder without having to worry about warping your vellum. Now remember, we still have this mini note card in our MISTI stamping tool on the sticky mat, and we still have our stamp in the same position. I'm inking that up with Gina K Warm Glow Amalgam ink, which is just a light color ink, and stamping it. I just wanted a light color ink so that I knew where to color in the lines. I'm coloring this with Copic markers, but you can use any color medium you want. The reason I did a light ink is I plan to do heat embossing on top of this afterwards. I don't want to heat emboss now because I don't like using Copic markers against embossing powder because sometimes it can damage the tip of your Copic markers, so I like to play it safe. Notice I still have my note card on my sticky mat. I figured I might as well not move it. I'll just take the sticky mat out of my MISTI stamping tool, and I put my release paper in there so my hand wouldn't stick to the mat as I did my coloring. So I'm coloring my image with Copic markers, but I'm not taking much care. This really does not need to be well done. I'm not the best at coloring. I just want to get a bold amount of color down. For this technique, the bolder the colors, the better. So I did my basic coloring here. I'm removing that release paper. Now I'm taking my sticky mat and putting it back into my MISTI stamping tool. Now I could leave this with no outline stamped on top. However, my coloring is not that good. If you look closely, it's really not that great. So I decided to stamp an outline on it. Instead of doing the embossing, which was my original plan, I decided to stamp with dark brown ink. This is milk chocolate from Gina K Designs. You could do heat embossing there. You could do no line coloring, anything you want. I can remove the extra ink from my sticky mat with a baby wipe, put the release paper back on it, and store it in my MISTI for later. Now, after I did that coloring, I can see that my coloring bled through my little mini note card that I have here. So I'm just cutting the front of it off. Instead of starting over, which I would not do at this point, I made another mini note card of the same size, and I'm gluing my colored piece on the front of it. That way you can't see the coloring through it. And there we have a new mini note card to go on the inside of our vellum note card. On the back of this mini note card, I'm putting a generous amount of adhesive. You want to make sure it doesn't come undone. I'm lining it up with the gold heat embossing on the front of our vellum note card. Once I have it lined up, I'll press it all down together. And this glues our mini note card inside of our vellum note card. And it's lined up so that the bold color shows through the front of the vellum card. I have another piece of white cardstock cut to the same size as our mini note card, and I'm gluing that to the back of the card. That gives me a nice place to do my Stamped by Jennifer message on the back of the card, and it gives it a nice, clean, finished look. Now it's time to add a sentiment to the front of our vellum note card. For this, I combined a Hugs die cut with a Sweet Friend stamp sentiment strip. The Sweet Friend is from this new Gina K Designs Thankful Greenery stamp set. This stamp set is actually free right now with a purchase of $75 or more at Gina K Designs and will later be available for purchase individually. So I just used Sweet Friend from this and gold heat embossed it on a white cardstock strip. I used the older Gina K Designs Hug die to die cut 3 times from red cardstock, and I glued them together for stacked dimension. Now I'm putting glue on the back of that die cut, and I'll add it to the front of our card. The glue I'm using is Gina K Designs Connect adhesive, a favorite of mine, and it holds nicely. I then have my Sweet Friend sentiment strip that's gold heat embossed. On the back of that, I'm putting 2 thin scraps of white cardstock. This will give a nice, solid, sturdy dimension to this cardstock strip. If I use foam tape, it might wiggle and not hold up through the mail. This will hold up nicely. So now I'm putting more liquid adhesive on the back of that and adding that right to the bottom of our word Hugs. To make the hugs stand out even more, I'm covering it with Tonic Aqua Shimmer Pen, which gives it a nice shimmer. I then will cover that with Ranger Glossy Accents, which will give it a nice shine and some dimension. So here's a look at the completed card. I did add some little gold gems to the background, and I stamped on my matching envelope. There you can see the beautiful shimmer and shine to the hugs that makes it stand out. And you can see how the red and green coloring on the inside shows through the vellum on the front. This is a great way to save time coloring. You could even do a smaller amount of coloring on the inside and allow it to show through. It also is a nice, unique design. It's great for large images like this one, and a wonderful way to bring in a metallic embossing powder. Once again, I do recommend a heavyweight vellum to make a note card from. I link to the one I like below. And I've done a video with vellum overlay cards, and I'll link to it at the top right if you want to check that out for more ideas. Okay, my next example is a vellum window that shows through to the inside of the card. This technique actually looks like the colored images are glowing. For this, I used the new kit from Gina K Designs called Festive Fall. Now this includes 3 6x8 stamp sets, those are the big ones, a stencil, the coordinating dies that you see, and several pieces of cardstock. The reason I use Gina K kits in my videos is the value is very good compared to the cost. So you get a lot in the kit for your money, and there are products that you can reuse over and over again. So in this kit is this 6x8 stamp set, and I'll use some of the others later on. Now from this one, I'm using the leaves, a sentiment, and the pumpkins. I have a piece of craft cardstock that is 4 by 5 1/4, a little bit smaller than the note card that I'll use. I have the little leaf border from that stamp set on my acrylic block, and I'm stamping it repeatedly with white pigment ink. After I've covered the entire background, I have 2 rectangle dies. One is slightly smaller than the other. I'm taking the smaller of the 2 rectangle dies and taping it to the top center of that piece and running it through my die cut machine. I used a Gemini Junior, but you can use any die cut machine you have. Now I have a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm holding my craft piece centered, and I'm putting adhesive at the center of that window. I'm popping my little rectangle piece that we just die cut onto the white note card. Then I'll remove that negative space. This is helping me get the position right for this die that I'm popping right over our die cut, taping onto our white note card. Then I'll open up the white note card and run it through our die cut machine. This way I can be sure that the window on our white note card lines up with that craft piece going on the front. Next, it's time to stamp the pumpkins on the vellum piece that will go across the window. I cut a piece of vellum using the larger of the two rectangle dies that I just showed you. On that piece of vellum, I'm stamping with VersaMark ink the pumpkins right at the center, and then I'm adding black embossing powder. Be sure to use an anti-static powder tool because that black embossing powder likes to stick everywhere. But if you use an anti-static powder tool, it keeps it nice and clean. I then can heat set this, and I have a nice raised shiny black image on that vellum. I'm also going to stamp the pumpkins on the inside of the window of our note card. I'm using regular black ink here, stamping it on the inside of the card. This will allow me a place to color pumpkins on the inside of the card, and it'll show through. Now on the front of the card, I'm putting adhesive and then laying the vellum to line up with the pumpkins on the inside. So I'll have pumpkins on the vellum that line up with the pumpkins stamped on the inside. Now I'm putting adhesive on the back of our craft piece and laying that over that, lining up with the window. Now I wanted to create a white frame around our window. So I have the same two rectangle dies from before. The smaller one was used to cut the window, the larger one was used to cut the vellum. I put them together on a piece of white cardstock and die cut it. Then I die cut a second, and this creates a thin rectangle frame. I'm gluing those two frames together, and then I'll put glue on the back of those and glue them around our window. By doing two frames together, it gives a nice raised look. So now I can add some coloring. I did coloring on the inside using Copic markers, nothing fancy. But I wanted the color to be more bold from the outside. So I'm adding color to the back of my vellum. The reason I'm doing it to the back is I don't touch the embossing powder then. And it makes it kind of glow through the vellum. Watch this, when I close it, look how it seems to glow through that vellum layer. So by doing color on the cardstock on the inside and on the back of the vellum, it makes it pop even more. Next, I stamped Hey Pumpkin with black ink. Then I stamped it again with VersaMark ink right on top. I then added black embossing powder and heat set it. By stamping first with black ink, then with VersaMark, and then putting black embossing powder on top, I am sure to get a nice, crisp, black, solid image. Here's a look at the completed card. We have the vellum window that you can see through to the pumpkins inside, and we can write a message below that. But when you close the card, look at how those pumpkins look like they glow. That's the fun of having color on the back of the vellum and behind the vellum on that white cardstock. This could be done with any coloring images. You could have flowers, leaves, critters, anything you want. It was really fun to use the pumpkins. Okay, now let's change gears completely for a completely different look. This time, I show how to use vellum to soften a bold background. This allows you to create kind of a focal point for your sentiment to stand out against that busy background. For this, I'm using the new Gina K Designs Innocent Orchid stamp set. This is a large 6x8 set, so that image is very large and can cover a card nicely. It's a beautiful, unique looking image. I'm starting with a note card that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm covering the front with adhesive. You could use glue stick here, but I used a tape runner. I also have lots of cardstock strips cut from purple and pink cardstock, all with various widths, and I'm putting them diagonally along the front of the card, covering it completely with these cardstocks. This is a great way to use up scraps, and you can use any colors you want. You could even use pattern paper. When done, I flipped it over and trimmed the excess off the edge, and here we have this beautiful card. Now I want to do white heat embossing on this. I have my sticky mat in my MISTI stamping tool, and I'm placing my card in the center. I then will use my anti-static powder tool. I always recommend using that when you're doing heat embossing. I then ink up my stamp with VersaMark ink and stamp it firmly onto my note card. There are little cracks and crevices on that background, so be sure to press firmly. You might want to ink it up twice and stamp it twice, just to be sure you have a good impression. Then I'm adding white embossing powder to the entire card and tapping off the excess. Then I'll heat set it and look at that beautiful image we have on our colorful background. However, this background is pretty bold. If I just put a sentiment on it, it might get lost. So we're going to create a soft spot at the center using Vellum. It'll soften the bold background and let our sentiment stand out more. If you look at this card closely, there's a big vellum oval, then there's an oval white frame. Inside of that frame is 2 layers of vellum so that it mutes the background even more, so the sentiment that says "you've been on my thoughts" stands out. Let's start by doing that white oval frame. I have 2 oval dies here, one slightly bigger than the other. I'm taping them together on white cardstock and running it through my die cut machine to create this thin oval frame. And I'll create 2 of those. Again, I really like adding dimension to my card, so gluing 2 together really makes it stand out. 3 is even better. I have 2 here, and you can see me gluing them together. I also die cut an oval from the larger of those 2 oval dies. You can see that vellum die cut there. And I heat embossed "You've Been in My Thoughts" on top of it towards the bottom. Now I'm gluing our oval frame around that, and look at that nice finished look it gives with that oval frame. Now on the back of that, I put adhesive around the edge, and I'm gluing it to a vellum oval that's bigger. So it's just a few sizes bigger than the frame that we created. Once again, I flipped it over, put adhesive on the back of that frame, and then added that to our note card. For me, I like to hide my adhesive between layers on vellum. There are adhesives that really don't show through vellum, but I don't trust them. So instead, I just hide my adhesive. So inside that white oval frame is a double layer of vellum. Outside of it is just a single layer, and you can tell the difference there in the photo. Now let's add the Hello die cuts. For this, I use the Gina K Designs Hello Caps die, which cuts the letters for hello. And I'm using that sticky mat that I use in my MISTI to line up the letters. So I die cut them from black cardstock, and you can see I'm lining them up on my sticky mat, getting the spacing just right. And the sticky holds it there until I'm ready to remove them. Once I have them positioned, I put some masking tape on top to pick all the letters up at once. Then I flip it over and put adhesive on the back. Then I pick up the tape and place it on my card and press it down. Once it's dry after a few minutes, I can remove the tape, and we have our hello perfectly spaced thanks to that sticky mat holding it while we get it just right and pick it up with a piece of masking tape. All right, now I wanted my hello to stand out a little bit more, so I did add the aqua shimmer pen for some sparkle and glossy accents for some shine. I also stamped that orchid image on a matching light pink envelope. So in this case, I had a very bold background, but by using 1 layer and 2 layers of vellum, I could soften that background to allow my sentiments to stand out even more. So vellum is a great tool if you have a busy background that you want to soften for your focal point. Okay, my next example is the same idea. I have a busy, bold background, and I softened it with vellum, but this time I heat embossed on the vellum my focal point images. This is a 5x7 card. I get a lot of requests for this larger size, so I thought it'd be fun to include. On this card, I'm using the new Gina K Designs Beautiful Bees stamp set. This has lots of great images, including those beautiful flowers and leaves. I'll be using a small bee image and a sentiment from this, and a larger bee on my envelope. I'll also be using this 6x8 stamp set that's included in that Festive Fall kit that I showed you at the beginning of this video. I'll use that silhouette image on the bottom left. And by the way, the "You've Been in My Thoughts" sentiment on my last card is from this stamp set. And although I don't use them in this video, I also really like the leaves included in the set. And then finally on this card, I'll be using this stencil that is also part of that Festive Fall card kit. By the way, I now store my stencils in these Gina K stencil pockets. They're the perfect size. And I put dark cardstock inside so I can easily see the stencil. These pockets are just like the ones that I used for my stamp set, but they're the size perfect for most stencils. The cardstock that I have in there is Gina K Tranquil Teal. I used to put white cardstock in my stencil envelopes, but I couldn't see the stencil because they're white also. So by putting a color cardstock in there, it's really helped me out. I'll do a video showing my new stencil storage soon, but I wanted to let you know about those Gina K stencil pockets because they are wonderful. Okay, just like my last card, I wanted to create a white frame around my vellum. This time I did a rectangle. So I have 2 rectangle dies, one slightly bigger than the other, taped to a piece of white cardstock. I'll run that through my die cut machine, and again, that creates a thin frame, and I'll do 3 of those this time. That'll give me dimension to that frame. In addition to my 3 die cut frames, I used the larger of the 2 rectangle dies to cut from a piece of vellum. That's the piece that we'll add our heat embossing to. A lighter weight vellum will allow more of the background to show through, but I use heavyweight vellum almost all the time. Now it's time to position our stamps inside of that frame. So I just have the frame in the corner of my MISTI stamping tool to help me get everything centered. So I have my large silhouette, my sentiment, and one of my bees. And I'm centering them inside of that frame. I close my MISTI stamping tool, I'll take the frame out, and put that piece of vellum that was cut with the larger of the 2 rectangle dies inside. I use my anti-static powder tool, stamp the images with VersaMark Ink, and now I'm adding white embossing powder. After I heat set that, I put the piece back into my MISTI stamping tool, and I'm stamping with VersaMark Ink another bee in a second spot, and adding white embossing powder and heat setting that. I wanted 2 bees in our background. Okay, now we have our white die cut frame. I glued 2 together, and then I'm gluing that onto our vellum. So you can see how it gives a nice frame to our vellum heat embossing. All that's left for this card is to create our background. You could create a background with any background technique that you want. You could do alcohol inks, anything. I took a piece of white cardstock that is a little bit smaller than 5 by 7 inches. I'm using an Altenew ink blending tool and applying different colors of Gina K ink. I have Tranquil Teal, Blue Raspberry, Lucky Clover, and Christmas Pines. So I'm just putting kind of clusters of color here and there. I then go and kind of overlap them and blend them together a little bit. It doesn't need to be perfect. I just wanted a variation of color in the background. Once I was done, I heat set it so it would dry a bit. Now I have the stencil from the Festive Fall Kit. And notice how the stencil's smaller than our background. So I found a point in the stencil where the pattern stopped, and I covered that with tape, so I'm masking it off. I then inked up half of our background, and then we'll do the other half, which you'll see me do in a moment. Okay, so you can see how the tape is masking off part of the pattern. Over this, I am applying white pigment ink with an ink blending brush. I'm really not blending it on, I'm dabbing it on. I do like to take the excess ink and wipe it onto a piece of scrap cardstock so I don't accidentally pick up some of the blue and green ink and bring it to my ink pad. So I'm just dabbing the white ink on, taking the excess off on the scrap paper, then we'll remove the stencil and look at that beautiful result. Now I did dab away some of the ink since it was so bright white. Wanted it to be a little bit softer. I dabbed it away with a dry cloth. Now I can rotate this and use our stencil on the other half. So there I'm lining it up with where we finished off with the stenciling, and I'm applying the white pigment ink in the same way, just tapping it on. By tapping it on, I get a heavier layer of white, and I don't mess around with that blue ink in the background and transfer it on my brush. I then remove my stencil, dab off some of the excess, and heat set it. I then added it to a 5 by 7 white note card. Now on the back of our white frame with the vellum in the center, I'll add this onto my card. So the vellum mutes that background in the center so that our white heat embossing shows on top. This is a really fun way to use any bold background that you have, and you can white and heat emboss any images onto vellum and frame them for the center of your card. I did add a few white pearls here and there for some dimension, but otherwise it's a pretty simple card. So this is another example of softening a bold background so you can create a focal point of your stamped images. This time I did white heat embossing. You could do silver or gold there if you wanted. I have a 5x7 envelope that I've had in my stash for a long time, and I stamped a bee on it to match the card, and that's from the same stamp set. Okay, my next example shows using vellum to die cut a word sentiment. This is a great way to use a large word sentiment and team it up with a sentiment strip. For this, I use the new Gina K Designs Bloomin' Wild stamp set. This has 2 large flowers, lots of leaves, and little flower blossoms. I'll be using the large flower here and then the small blossoms for some soft stamping on the background. For my sentiment strip, I use the Gina K Designs On My Mind stamp set. This is an older one that I've used many times. I stamped it with black ink on a white cardstock strip, and now I'm gluing 2 scraps of white cardstock to the back of it to give it a bit of dimension. I also used that bold hello die that I used earlier to die cut 2 layers from vellum. So you'll see 2 of each letter up there from vellum. I stamped, colored, and die cut one of the large flowers. I used Copic markers to make this really bright flower so it would really stand out. I took that sticky mat out of my MISTI stamping tool, and I have it on my work surface here, and I'm using it to arrange the hello from the vellum, so I can make sure that they're all straight and separated just right. Sorry my head gets in the way, but it's the best way to get it lined up. Once I have hello all lined up, I can connect them with my sentiment strip. So I'm putting just a dot of liquid adhesive towards the bottom of each of those letters. Just a little bit, you don't need much. This is a strong adhesive. Now I can lay my sentiment strip on top of that. I'll just press it down, give it a few minutes to dry. You can put something heavy on it while it dries. Then when it is dry, you can lift the sentiment strip and all your letters will be connected to it. Now I could add this to my flower, but I noticed that the vellum letters were a little too sheer, like too much of the color was showing through. So I decided to double up my hello die cuts. So I'm putting some adhesive on the back of the sentiment strip and adding a second vellum letter. Now you could use a vellum safe adhesive to glue those together, but in this case, I like the idea of floating vellum letters only connected by the adhesive on the back of the sentiment strip. It worked out just fine. Then I put adhesive on the back of the sentiment strip and then added it to my note card using a T-ruler to make sure I got it straight. So the only adhesive attaching all of that is on the back of the sentiment strip, and the little vellum letters are just floating behind it. It's a really cool look in real life. So by doubling up the vellum, those hello letters stood out even more. So here's a look at the completed card. On the background, I used a piece of craft cardstock where I stamped the blossom image repeatedly with white pigment ink. Here's a closer look at the vellum letters and the sentiment strip that's holding them onto our card. So vellum is a great way to add something subtle also to your card, in this case, the word hello behind the main stamped sentiment strip. Okay, my last card example shows one of my favorite vellum techniques, and that is to add color to vellum, and this works great with any coloring image. For this, I'm using the other stamp set from the Festive Falls kit from Gina K Designs. This is a beautiful set with 3 beautiful flowers that are fun to color. What I decided to do was white heat emboss those 3 flowers on vellum. So this is just white heat embossed. And then on the back of that, I'm adding color with Copic markers. You can also use any permanent marker like a Sharpie, or try out any marker that you may have. Alcohol ink works great on vellum too. So on the back, I'm adding bold color with Copic markers. You can always flip it over and make sure you like the results by putting it onto a white note card so it shows through. Again, I'm coloring on the back of the vellum. I could color on the front, but when color hits the white embossing, it colors the embossing. And some embossing powders seem to do damage to the tip of Copics, so I don't like to take the chance. So for me, I add color to the back. So I just added blues to one flower, I did greens to another, and pinks to another, and yellow and orange to the center of each. This is not a blending card. All I'm doing is putting down solid color. You don't need to spend much time doing this, so just a quick one color does it. After I finished coloring, I used a circle die to cut each of my flowers out. I wanted to add the 3 circles onto a white note card. I could hide my adhesive behind the vellum, as I've done many times in this video, but this time I thought I'd put vellum on the entire back of these die cut circles. To do so, I use my Xyron Creative Station. There are many vellum friendly adhesives out there. I'm not a big fan of most, but this one's pretty good. So I put my 3 vellum pieces into the station, then I turn the crank on the side, and it basically turns them each into stickers. It comes out the other side as you see here, and you just use the blade to cut across it. I then use a bone folder or my fingers to rub around each of the die cuts. This works with regular die cuts too, by the way. And then you remove the release paper, and basically you have a sheet here with 3 vellum stickers on it. I then can peel off each of the circles and add them onto my card. The entire back is covered with adhesive. So if you're looking for a vellum adhesive, this is one of my favorites. Maybe some folks can share their favorites below in the YouTube description, but I'll tell you, I usually just hide my adhesive behind an embellishment or sentiment. Okay, so I added these to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card, and then I trimmed off the excess. I have a thank you for always being there sentiment that I white heat embossed on a black cardstock strip, and I added that over one of my circles. And I also added some white pearls to the background. The thank you is from an older Gina K Designs stamp set called Bold and Blooming. And the for always being there sentiment is from the Thankful Greenery stamp set that I showed you earlier in this video. So one of the reasons I like this technique of putting color on the back of vellum is that it's very forgiving. You don't need to take time to blend or do anything special. It looks kind of like a stained glass from the front when you're done. Okay, there are a bunch of ways to use vellum creatively on your cards. I hope it's helpful and that you can use some of these techniques with products in your craft room. If you're interested in the particular products I used today, I always link them below in my YouTube description. At the top of my description is a link to a visual supply list so you can see pictures of them all if that's helpful. In the middle are a couple other vellum videos that you might like. I thank you again always for spending this time with me. I hope you have a wonderful day and get some time to create. Take care and we'll see you soon.